Okay, so today we're going to look at the road to revolution and the American Revolution. We're going to hit some key topics and concepts that you're going to need to know for this class. So, the road to revolution really all starts with the French and Indian War, even though Great Britain had controlled the colonies for about 150 years up to this point. And why is that? Well, in the French and Indian War, the British and the colonists are going to realize that they are nothing alike anymore. Essentially, a new nationality, a new group of people had arisen here in the colonies that were much different than pretty much preppy and snobby English men and women. So in 1754, the British and the French go to war over the territory of North America. Now, a part of this was the Albany Plan of Union, put together by Ben Franklin. He makes a pretty famous political cartoon here known as Join or Die, a serpent representing each colony, symbolizing that if the colonies don't unify together to exterminate the French presence, then there won't be a colonial America. This plan essentially failed, ironically, but the British and the colonists would defeat the French in the French and Indian War. Now, as a result of the French and Indian War, many important events occurred that will pretty much be the road to revolution. On top of the fact that the colonists started to realize that they don't need the British anymore during the war. So when the war ends, it ends a solitary neglect period in colonial American history. And what is this? Well, for the last 150 years, the British really haven't cared too much about what the colonists have been doing. They've created their own governments with the House of Burgesses. They created their own economic systems, their ways of life, all that stuff, and the British really haven't ever intervened. Now, as a result of this war, the British are going to have to intervene, and guess who's going to be upset about that? You're right, the colonists. And why are the British all of a sudden going to reassert its power? Well, two things occurred. They acquired a huge amount of territory from the French in North America, and they acquired a huge amount of war debt. So they are going to need to implement more power in the colonies to really benefit from this large area. One of the reasons the colonists fought with the British in the French and Indian War is because they were hoping that they would be able to get some of the land that they won from it. However, due to Native American resistance movements such as Pontiac's Rebellion, the British Parliament is going to pass something known as the Proclamation Line of 1763, which stated that no colonists can settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Why did they do this? Well, the British didn't want to deal with any more wars, especially with Native Americans. So how do you solve that? You just don't let settlers move west. Well, the settlers aren't going to be very happy about this because one of the reasons they fought in the war was so that they can get some of this land. So on top of the debt, you have land. Land issue was solved with the proclamation, but the debt here, the question will be, well, who's going to pay for this? The British certainly didn't want to pay for this all on themselves. So what they decided to do was tax the colonists. You know what? This war was fought in colonial America, have the colonists pay for it. So they do this through indirect and direct taxes. The first tax imposed by British Parliament was the Sugar Act. Purpose was to generate revenue. It was an indirect tax. The colonists actually didn't see the tax when they purchased sugar in the colonies, but the colonists resist this by smuggling goods through many of the backwater ways of colonial America that the British just didn't have the manpower to investigate and make sure that smuggling didn't occur. Not a whole much fuss over the Sugar Act, but the Stamp Act will cause a lot more problems. This is the first direct tax, meaning that when you go purchase something, you see the tax actually added onto the bill before you pay for it. And it was a tax on the 50 most commonly used goods in colonial America, so the British knew that they would gain a lot of money from this. And the colonists are not happy whatsoever. And this is when you get the famous war cry, no taxation without representation. The colonists weren't able to vote on any of the taxes being passed on in Parliament because they weren't born English citizens. They were born in colonial America, so therefore they had no power in Parliament. This will lead to the Stamp Act Congress being formed. And really what that is a bunch of some of the colonies, mostly in the New England area, are going to form kind of a little coalition to stop the Stamp Act. And one of the main ways to stop it is by boycotting and not purchasing any of the goods that the tax is on. And it would really be the first attempt at colonial unity against British rule. We are not yet at the war or the Declaration of Independence. Okay, so to continue on here, the Stamp Act will eventually be repealed because the colonists boycotted so much, and a lot of other issues ensue, like violence such as tar and feathering Stamp Act agents, burning down some of the buildings, so on and so forth. So the British actually repealed the Stamp Act. They just get rid of it. But the British, because they are on a power kick, they need to make sure that they know the colonists are still under their control. So they passed some act or law known as the Declaratory Act, and it pretty much says that Britain can pass all laws in the future, including taxes, whenever they want. And this was kind of the idea that, hey, look, we're still in charge of you, even though we repealed the Stamp Act because of you, we're still in charge of you, and the Declaratory Act says that. So the British will continue to try to pass a bunch of acts. One will be the Townshend Acts. It will be a tax on imports. But again, because of colonial resistance, mostly through the radical group known as the Sons of Liberty, they will repeal this too. Okay, so things are going to start heating up a little bit more in the 1770s. Because more and more British soldiers were having to be sent to the colonies to kind of try to enforce laws, in Boston, you're going to have many soldiers. And in 1770, the Boston Massacre will occur. And here's a famous portrait, actually. It's an engraving by Paul Revere, who later on will be known as, the famous guy who made the Midnight Ride. But this picture depicts that the British opened fire on a very innocent crowd. 5 colonists are killed, including an African American, Crispus Attucks. But no British soldiers were killed, and none were really even tried here in the colonies. They were sent back to Great Britain to be tried, which in the end really didn't do much to them. Now, as the war debt is not getting paid off, the Tea Act will be passed because many of the British Parliament members are stockholders in the British East India Company, and they're losing a lot of money. So these members of the British Parliament end up passing the Tea Act because they need to figure out a way for this business not to go out of business. And the colonists are not happy because one of their major drinks of choice is tea. Back then, you didn't have a variety of drinks like we did today. You had tea, you had whiskey, and milk. I mean, I can't even say water because there wasn't a lot of clean drinking water. It was a process. So the colonists aren't happy about this. So it will lead to the Boston Tea Party in 1773, shortly after the Tea Act is passed. The Sons of Liberty, again, like I mentioned, the radical group led by Samuel Adams, the cousin of John Adams and John Quincy Adams. Native Americans will dress up, go to the Boston Harbor, and they will ransack all the British East India Company's tea and throw it into the Boston Harbor, and therefore you have the British East India Company losing lots and lots of money. And Parliament, who many have stock in the British East India Company, are not very happy about this. So what do? They pass what is known as, in Great Britain, the Coercive Acts, but here in the colonies, we will know them as the Intolerable Acts. So they close the Port of Boston. Hey, look, no one can get anything in and out of the Port of Boston, which is going to hurt many of the merchants in Boston. And then the Quartering Act, which the Quartering Act was already in place, but not really enforced, but now it will be. And what will that lead to? Colonial unity yet again known as the First Continental Congress in 1774. Now, shortly after this, the Continental Congress, you're going to have the first major skirmish of what we will now call the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world is what we remember this for, Paul Revere and his Midnight Ride. Now, many people were not ready to go to war with Great Britain, especially colonists. Reason being is because many colonists didn't have faith in themselves. If you compare the British to the colonies on paper, it was a no-brainer that the British would easily win any confrontation that would ensue. So it's going to take a lot of effort for everybody to get on board to actually unify the colonies to fight against the British. The First Continental Congress would disband, and then later on in May of 1775, with the colonies still in a state of rebellion, as King George referred to it as, the Second Continental Congress will reconvene. Here some important things occur. They are going to manage the war effort because that's what is going on right now, and eventually will move towards an independence movement, and they will set up kind of a de facto government at this time. Later on, the Articles of Confederation, then you'll have the Constitutional Convention, but we'll get to that later. The Olive Branch Petition, penned by Ben Franklin, was really an attempt to avoid full-blown out war. Really, it was asking, hey, if you give us representation in Parliament as colonists, we will stop this rebellion and we will be under your control. But King George decided to go against this because he didn't think that the colonists were worth having in Parliament because they were considered second-class citizens since they were born here. Okay, so now the road to independence. Thomas Paine writes his very famous pamphlet, Common Sense, and the importance of this is it urged colonists to break away from Great Britain. Like I said, many people weren't sure exactly what to do because they were going against such a strong adversary. But this kind of was a pamphlet that would circulate throughout the colonies and influence Americans to, hey, you know what, maybe this is the right thing to do. And finally, the Second Continental Congress, after about a month and a half of debating, will declare independence and release it on July 4th, 1776. We formally break away, and major influences would be the Enlightenment and John Locke and social contracts with their government. So now that we are in a state of rebellion for sure, we are declaring our independence as the United States of America. We will form the Articles of Confederation, a very weak central government, strong state governments, because that's exactly what we were fighting against, and we wanted the opposite. So the Revolutionary War, some key points here. War doesn't start out very well for us under George Washington and the Continental Army, but in 1777, the victory for the colonists at the Battle of Saratoga would be a major turning point because France now has decided to enter the war on behalf of the colonists, meaning now we have really the second major world power on our side versus the British, and that's really going to swing the tide of the war. And by 1781, at the Battle of Yorktown, Lord Cornwallis surrenders, ending the fighting of the American Revolution, but it would not legally come to an end until 1783 with the Treaty of Paris, where Great Britain will recognize an independent United States of America and will extend our boundaries all the way up into the Mississippi River.